Hi there. Welcome to 19th Century Art. In this third part and final part of our lectures on the end of the century, fin de siècle, we are going to look at the way artists chose new directions, what was inspiring the new art movements at the end of the century, what movements failed to take hold and which ones carry on into the future. To begin with, I want to show you a picture I saw last year in Cleveland that I was quite taken by. Wilhelm Hammershøi, the Strandgrad in Sunshine from 1906. I had never heard of this artist, and it was just such a stunning painting. It was so simple, it was so quiet, so subdued, but there's just a symphony of grays and muted colors there. It's so delicate, so restrained. It surprised me that I'd never heard of this artist before, and it seemed at once such a perfect expression of the end of the century, and at the same time so at odds with everything else I knew about what I had seen by other artists at this time. So I present him to you as a really interesting contrast, as an artist who's clearly taking inspiration by James McNeill Whistler, that sort of studies in gray, that very severe intellectual composition, the architecture of the room, the delicacy of everything, the subtlety of the play of light, really has a feeling for a place and a time, but it's so drained of that sort of primitive engagement with this aggressive search for something new, something different. It seems really to dive deep into what's here and now in Europe. To a degree, it's really quite a shift from the direction of art going on elsewhere. He's a celebrated artist in Denmark who really focused in on quiet spaces, mystery, and silences. Just beautiful, but again, quite different. Another artist which I've just recently become acquainted with is Paula Modersohn-Becker. Here is an extraordinary woman artist whose career was cut short by a death from complications in childbirth. This self-portrait on her 6th wedding anniversary in 1906 is a really incredible painting that is currently on display Art Institute of Chicago. Wonderful, brilliant use of color. She's painting in an oil tempera, so there's a kind of cakey chalkiness. Oil tempera is where you use eggs and oil, egg yolks and oil. You get this very warm, very thick paint pigment. It doesn't have the translucency of typical oil paints. It's very much oriented on the surface of the painting. There's a kind of exaggeration in the eyes and nose and hands, but the body is so carefully looked at. As a self-portrait, this is an extraordinary painting for the sake that it is considered the first time in the history of Western art, or anywhere that anyone has yet to recognize, that a woman has painted a self-portrait as a nude. And this is interesting for many reasons. First of all, this being, as she states, her wedding anniversary. She seems to be shyly looking out at us with this kind of questioning. And furthermore, she painted this when she was actually separated from her husband, and she was decided to leave him. The pressures of being a wife and the expectation of her becoming a mother was just too much. So when she painted this, she was separated from her husband and she wasn't pregnant. And so this is really quite of an extraordinary painting in the sense that it's this questioning, like, is this something that you want from me? And what is the cost of this? Of course, tragically, in a very short order, return to her husband, become pregnant, and give birth to her daughter, and die a week after giving birth from an aneurysm. And so we have this incredible career. The potential for this artist seemed extraordinary. And it's tragically another direction that art did not take. She had been interested in Gauguin and Van Gogh, and you can see that kind of rich, vibrant interest in colors and intensity of paint on canvas. But again, she was just starting out, and we can't be sure where this would have gone had she had the opportunity to complete her career as a painter. Now, the artist who's probably most famous from this end of the century is Gustav Klimt. Again, he was a part of an avant-garde movement called the Vienna Succession that dropped out of the major art academy and decided to take their work in a completely different way. They were inspired by romantic music. They were inspired by antique art past. And they brought this classicism in a new direction in that they wanted to allow for this bold graphic quality and the patterning to overwhelm the figure and the forms of nature. So we have here Pallas Athena and this really wonderful, vibrant. Now, the gold frame is a really important part of the painting. And like many cases, I don't include the painting frame, but in this case, it really is by the artist and designed to create it. And this is what Gustav Klimt was really interested in, was not just making a painting, but he was interested in creating an experience and an environment, what we would call a Gesamtkunstwerk, this total work of art, that was situated in a location, in an environment, and it would involve all of our senses. And this is what makes his painting so vibrant and so intense, is the sense that they are, again, alive and in space. Gustav Klimt had an extraordinary career. He was very famous. He was a celebrity artist. Women were all over him, wanting him to paint this portrait, and he had this really kind of larger-than-life existence. Unfortunately, his art gets picked up by the Nazis. Like a lot of these avant-garde artists, he is pointed out as a degenerate artist, and a lot of his work becomes destroyed in World War II. Fortunately, they've been able to reconstruct some of these from photographs and things, or small fragments returned. But he did a number of murals, very famous murals, in buildings and spaces. This Medicine Academy in 1901. And again, this really amazing way he blends patterning and forms, the way he uses the figure and breaks up the figure through this rich use of archaic designs. The women's bodies tumble through this very confused space. And it's very highly designed and sensual. This was part of what he was going to do, get away from that sort of stodgy, conservative approach to art and really explore the senses, and the senses in a very spiritual way. Again, Beethoven was a huge inspiration. This is part of a major work he created, Beethoven Frieze from 1902. And we can see the way he brings the physicality and into this heavily gilded space. It really has part of the flatness of Japanisme and the art of, that design of Noten, this very graphic way of representing forms. And that was part of what he really excelled at. You see here this wonderful painting, the Tree of Life, this beautiful spirals out. It has this archaic quality. And again, the figures melding into this world in this spiritual way. And this is part of what he was trying to get people to see, is that art is this physical expression of the immaterial, spiritual nature of being. And so a lot of the portraits that he drew, he really has the figure just become dissolve into this heavily graphic space. Beautiful, stunning, and exciting to see, like a mosaic, all this wonderfully rich patterning that's going on. Otherwise, aside from all the gold and the patterning, it's a fairly conventional portrait. One of his most famous paintings is The Kiss, a theme that Rodin had also done. And again, this way in which this romantic idea of the kiss and the envelopment of love and the dissolving of these bodies is part of this mythology of the Vienna Secessionists, which he was a part of. His portraiture, again, you get a feeling for the person like Vincent van Gogh, this way in which the patterns and the designs of their spirit kind of emanate out from their representation, so that it becomes them in this wild environment. Here, one of his late works, Baby in a Cradle, this wonderful tumult of fabrics and materials and patterns, and we just see the baby's face sort of peeking out above the top. Just a wonderful splashes of colors and forms. It seems unfinished, and in many ways it has this looseness, which actually many of his works seem to miss. They seem more heavily overwrought. Surprisingly, Gustav Klimt, despite his enormous popularity, does not lead into a modern art movement that carries on into the 20th century. He has popularity. He continues to interest a lot of people, collect his work. But the artist who really begins to change the way people think about art is a postman, Ferdinand Cheval. Now, I exaggerate only a little. Ferdinand Cheval was a postman who, one day, while out delivering letters, he came across a rock. And he was so fascinated by this rock, he brought it home, and then he began to collect rocks. And he collected more and more rocks along his route until he actually would go about with a wheelbarrow and collect all these rocks until he started to create this castle out of all of the found rocks during his postal delivery. And this amazing castle that he created had this incredible inspiration for him. He just had this vision. Part of it is inspired by, as we know, the discovery of Angkor Wat, and we can see in the architectural forms these undulating, mysterious shapes and arches and columns. All of this has this vague sort of oriental quality. Now, Cheval had no artistic training. He had no background in art. He really is what we call an outsider artist. He has a vision, and he just goes with it. And locals just thought him kind of crazy. But as word got out that there was this place outside of Paris, this palace, this postman had made, artists began to make a pilgrimage to his very extraordinary palace. The Palais Ideal by postman Ferdinand Cheval, which he worked on from 1879 to 1912, is now a park in France. You can go visit. It is really an extraordinary experience to be in front of this postman's vision, right? He really followed through. He was inspired by Napoleon. And this idea that what one person can do, what one person can accomplish by sheer will alone, he brought himself to create this palace from the most simplest of means that he had about him. So a filmmaker and writer, Jacques Bernard Brunis, happened upon the Palais Ideal in 1928 and brought word back of it to his community in Paris. The Surrealism founder, André Breton, made the trip, as did photographers Lee Miller, Robert Doisneau, and Bresson, who all shot Cheval's castle Max Ernst went to and created the collage, the postman ideal. Picasso made a series of sketches as well. And so the postman really captured the imagination of some of the great leading artists of the 20th century because he was willing to take that risk. He was willing to go and do something without knowing what he was doing. And that sort of primitive impulse, that urge to just make something, I think is what really drives a lot of the 20th century. The ideal artist is the outsider. And the outsider is the person with this vision and this drive to create something that no one has ever seen before, even themselves. So I want to do a quick overview of what we've covered in this class to kind of knit it all together, beginning with the early 19th century, 1800. We began talking about history painting and how it evolves out and into neoclassical movements in France and how this spread through other countries. And in reaction to that, and in elaboration of that, was Romanticism. We talked about the picture stories of Hogarth and how they evolved into Rudolf Topser's sequential art. At the same time, we have the invention of lithography. And Romanticism expands into this exotic fascination with Asia and the Orient, and we have this emergence of Orientalism. Then in the mid-century, we have photography beginning to take new directions, and new movement in landscape becomes a very important part. We talked about the way in which landscape in the countries were, changing dramatically, the way people were moving through the space because of locomotives. Industrialization was transforming things. And there's new ideas about realism and movement of socialism and evolution all come into the middle of the century. And this brings us to this new discovery about light and color. And we have the emergence of new kinds of paints that allow you to paint outside. So the Barbizon school evolves into Impressionism, where people are actually going outside and painting from nature. Toward the end of the century, the industrialism had a backlash, and many people wanted a return to an idea about craftsmanship, the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the discovery of Japanese art, and the exquisite design sense that the Japanese brought to their compositions heavily influenced Impressionism and aestheticism. The idea that all this meaning that people had been lading onto art was really taking us away from what art does best, which is to give us an aesthetic experience. That is what aestheticism was trying to get back, art for art's sake. Later, Impressionism gets new ways of expressing itself outside just capturing the real and the sensations of light. The subjective experiences of the artist come into play. And so we have Van Gogh, we have Seurat, we have Gauguin, we have Cézanne. All these are very distinctive artists whose facture, whose individual way of working really distinguishes itself. And then, again, the arts and crafts movement is a part of that pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood ideal of resisting the dehumanization of the industrialization. Again, Art Nouveau comes out of arts and crafts. It has this wonderful Japanisme quality to it, the flatness, the archaic designs, beautiful outlines and decorative forms. Art starts to go inward into subjective ideas about symbolism and color, and then personal expression with Expressionism. And through it all, a lot of art is coming more and more to this romantic idea that the artist individually has something to say to society. Not that the artist is beholden to society or has a responsibility to reflect society, but they, as individuals, have their own unique voice to contribute.